Sophia Carter was running late. Again. Her heels clicked against the polished marble floors of Walker Enterprises as she rushed down the hallway, clutching a stack of files close to her chest. Her blonde hair, which had been neatly tied in a bun that morning, now had a few loose strands falling into her face. She barely had time to fix them. Her boss was waiting, and if she didn't get to his office within the next 2 minutes, she was convinced she would be fired on the spot. Sophia had been working as an executive secretary at Walker Enterprises for only 2 weeks, and it had already been the most stressful job she had ever had. It wasn't that she was incapable of handling the work. She was smart, organized, and determined to succeed. The problem was her boss, Sebastian Walker. The name alone sent shivers down her spine. At just 32 years old, he was one of the most powerful CEOs in the country. He had built his empire from the ground up, turning Walker Enterprises into a billion-dollar corporation. He was ruthless, intelligent, and impossibly handsome. Unfortunately, he was also cold, strict, and had zero tolerance for incompetence. Sophia had heard the rumors before she started working for him. Stories of employees who had been fired on the spot for making the slightest mistakes. Stories of how he never smiled, never showed any emotion, and certainly never involved himself with his employees on a personal level. He was, in every sense of the word, untouchable. And yet, here she was, barely 2 weeks in, already making mistake after mistake. Today, her mistake had been forgetting to deliver an important report on time. She had spent hours finalizing the document, double-checking every detail to make sure it was perfect. But in the chaos of answering emails and taking phone calls, she had lost track of time. Now, as she sprinted toward his office, she felt her stomach twist with anxiety. She needed a moment to breathe. A moment to gather herself before stepping into the office of the most intimidating man she had ever met. And so, without thinking, she pushed open the door to the nearest bathroom. The second she stepped inside, she knew something was wrong. The room was sleek and modern, with dark marble counters and floor-to-ceiling mirrors. But what caught her attention wasn't the luxurious design. It was the scent. Unlike the floral air fresheners usually found in the women's restroom, this one smelled distinctly masculine. Then she heard the sound of running water. Her heart stopped. Slowly, almost fearfully, she turned her head toward the sink. Standing there, washing his hands with an expression of mild amusement, was none other than Sebastian Walker. For a second, her brain completely shut down. Then realization hit her like a freight train. "Oh my God!" she gasped, slapping a hand over her mouth. Sebastian glanced up, his piercing blue eyes meeting hers in the mirror. He didn't look angry. If anything, he looked entertained. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice deep and smooth. "You do realize this is the men's restroom?" Sophia felt her entire body heat up with embarrassment. I didn't. Oh my God, I wasn't paying attention, Sebastian turned off the faucet, shaking the water from his hands before grabbing a paper towel. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms over his broad chest as he studied her. Clearly. "I am so sorry," she stammered, taking a step back toward the door. This was a mistake. Huge mistake. I'll just... Relax, Miss Carter." His voice was calm, but it only made her panic more. How could she possibly relax when she had just barged into the men's restroom and caught her CO washing his hands? "I should go," she blurted out, spinning on her heel. But in her haste, she miscalculated her step. Her foot slipped against the polished tile, and before she could regain her balance, she stumbled, straight into Sebastian. It was as if time slowed down. 1 second she was trying to escape. The next, she was pressed against his chest, her hands resting against the firm fabric of his suit jacket. "No." Sebastian caught her without hesitation, his hands gripping her waist to steady her. His touch was warm, firm, and oh God, she could smell his cologne, rich and intoxicating. For a moment, neither of them moved. Sophia felt her pulse skyrocket. Her face was so close to his that she could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the sharp angles of his cheekbones, and the way his blue eyes darkened slightly as they studied her. "Careful," he murmured. She could barely breathe. This isn't happening. This isn't happening. She stammered, scrambling to push herself away. I didn't mean. Sebastian let go of her immediately, stepping back as she practically stumbled toward the door. Miss Carter, he called just as she reached the exit. She turned, still mortified beyond belief. Yes, sir. His lips twitched slightly, almost as if he were fighting back a smirk. Next time, try to use the correct restroom. She didn't answer. She just bolted out the door, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear anything else. As soon as she was outside, she leaned against the wall, pressing her hands to her burning face. Kill me now. Little did she know, inside the restroom, Sebastian Walker, who rarely found humor in anything, was still smirking to himself. And for the first time in a long time, he found himself intrigued. Sebastian Walker was not a man who got distracted easily. His life was built around structure, discipline, and unwavering focus. He had spent years perfecting his ability to separate emotions from business, never allowing personal matters to interfere with his work. That was why he had become one of the most successful CEOs in the country, because nothing and no one could shake his composure. Till now. Ever since the incident in the restroom, he found himself thinking about Sophia Carter more than he should. It was ridiculous, really. She was just his secretary, an employee like any other. And yet, there was something about her that lingered in his mind, something that made him notice her in ways he hadn't before. At first, he told himself it was simple curiosity. She was different from the people he usually surrounded himself with. Where others were polished and calculated, she was flustered and awkward. Where others carefully measured their words around him, she blurted out whatever was on her mind. And where others seemed intimidated by his presence, she somehow managed to embarrass herself in front of him in the most unexpected ways. But what frustrated him the most was that he didn't find it annoying. He found it amusing. And that was a problem. Sebastian did not get amused. Sitting in his office, he leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping against the desk as he stared at his computer screen without actually reading the emails in front of him. His thoughts kept drifting back to Sophia, her startled expression when she realized her mistake, the way her cheeks flushed bright red, the way she had practically run out of the restroom as if she wanted to disappear. A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips before he shook his head, clearing his thoughts. Focus, Walker. A knock on the door pulled him from his distraction. Come in, he said. The door opened, and as if the universe was playing some sort of joke on him, Sophia walked in, holding a folder close to her chest. Mr. Walker, she said, her voice slightly nervous. I have the reports you requested. Sebastian nodded, watching as she approached his desk. He noticed the way she avoided looking directly at him, her hands gripping the folder a little too tightly. Still embarrassed, he thought with amusement. Put them on my desk, he instructed. She quickly complied, setting the folder down and stepping back as if she wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. Is there anything else you need? She asked, her tone polite but slightly stiff. Sebastian studied her for a moment. Normally, he wouldn't engage in unnecessary conversation with his employees, but something about the way she was acting made him want to push her just a little. Are you always this nervous around me, Miss Carter? Sophia's eyes widened slightly. What? Well, I mean She cleared her throat, forcing herself to stand straighter. I just want to be professional, sir. Sebastian raised an eyebrow. Is that so? She nodded quickly. He leaned back in his chair, tilting his head slightly as he watched her. Then why do you look like you want to run out of my office right now? Her face turned an impressive shade of red. I don't. You do, he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. Sophia swallowed, clearly struggling to compose herself. She took a deep breath before finally meeting his gaze. I just don't want to make any more mistakes, she admitted. I know I'm still new here, and I want to prove that I belong. For a moment Sebastian said nothing. There was something honest about her words, something that made him see her in a slightly different light. She wasn't just flustered and awkward, she was determined. She cared about her work, even if she was still adjusting. Most people in his company feared him because of his reputation. But Sophia, she feared failure more than she feared him. Interesting. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "You're doing fine, Miss Carter." She blinked, clearly surprised. I am. Yes, he said simply. Sophia looked at him as if trying to decide whether or not he was serious. Then, slowly, her shoulders relaxed a little. "Thank you, sir," she said softly. Sebastian gave her a small nod before turning his attention back to his computer screen. "That will be all." She hesitated for a moment before nodding and quickly making her way toward the door. Just as she reached for the handle, Sebastian spoke again. "And Miss Carter." She turned back, looking at him expectantly. His lips twitched slightly. "Try to use the right restroom next time." Her entire face turned red in an instant. Sebastian didn't say anything else. He just smirked. Sophia made a strangled sound before rushing out of the office, leaving him alone once more. As the door clicked shut behind her, Sebastian leaned back in his chair, staring at the spot where she had just been. He knew he shouldn't be entertained by her reactions. He knew he should forget about her and focus on his work. But for some reason, he found himself looking forward to their next encounter. Sophia Carter was doing her best to keep a low profile. Ever since the incident, as she now called it in her head, she had tried to avoid unnecessary interactions with Sebastian Walker. Unfortunately, that was nearly impossible, given that she was his secretary. But she had mastered the art of quick exits and minimal eye contact, ensuring that their conversations remained strictly professional. It would have been a great plan. If only Sebastian wasn't making it so damn difficult. For some reason, he had started noticing her more. He would call her into his office more often, ask for small tasks that she was sure he could have assigned to someone else, and worst of all, he had developed a habit of teasing her. It wasn't outright flirting. Sebastian Walker didn't flirt. But there was something about the way he smirked when he caught her getting flustered, something about the way he would throw in a comment about the restroom incident just when she had finally started to forget about it. It was driving her insane. And now, as she sat at her desk, typing out an email, she had the distinct feeling that someone was watching her. She didn't have to look up to know who it was. "Miss Carter," Sebastian's deep voice called from his office doorway. Sophia inhaled sharply before forcing herself to look up. "Yes, sir." His blue eyes held a glint of amusement. "Come to my office." She quickly stood up, smoothing her skirt as she walked toward him. Sebastian stepped aside, letting her enter before he closed the door behind her. She swallowed hard, feeling slightly nervous. Something about the way he was watching her made her heart race. "You called, sir?" she asked, keeping her voice professional. Sebastian leaned against his desk, arms crossed. "Are you busy tonight?" Sophia blinked. "Excuse me. Do you have plans?" he repeated. Her heart skipped a beat. Was he asking her out? Well, that was impossible. She had to be misunderstanding. I don't think so, sir," she said hesitantly. "Good," he said simply. "You're coming to dinner with me." Her brain short-circuited. "I'm what?" "Dinner," he repeated, as if she was being slow. "I have a business meeting with a potential investor, and I need a second set of ears. You'll take notes, handle any scheduling concerns, and assist with negotiations if necessary." Sophia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Course, this wasn't personal. This was work. "Understood," she said, nodding. Sebastian tilted his head slightly, as if studying her reaction. "Meet me downstairs at 7. "Yes, sir," she said quickly, eager to leave before she did something embarrassing. But as she turned toward the door, his voice stopped her again. "And Miss Carter." She turned back, bracing herself. His lips curved into a slight smirk. "Try not to walk into the wrong restaurant this time." Her mouth fell open, but before she could form a response, he had already turned his attention to his computer. Sophia stormed out of the office, her face burning. Sebastian Walker was impossible. That evening, Sophia found herself seated in an upscale restaurant, feeling painfully out of place. She had gone home after work to change, opting for a simple but elegant black dress and a pair of modest heels. When she had arrived at the restaurant, Sebastian was already waiting, looking effortlessly sophisticated in his dark suit. The investor they were meeting, Richard Calloway, was a man in his 50s with a sharp mind and an even sharper tongue. Throughout dinner, Sophia remained professional, taking notes as Sebastian discussed business strategies with him. But there was something strange about the way Calloway kept looking between her and Sebastian, as if trying to figure something out. At one point he leaned back in his chair, smirking. "So, how long have you two been together?" Sophia choked on her drink. "What?" Sebastian, to her horror, didn't seem fazed at all. He simply raised an eyebrow. "She's my secretary, Calloway. That's all." Calloway chuckled, clearly unconvinced. "Right. And I'm the King of England." Sebastian said nothing, but Sophia could feel his gaze on her. For the rest of the dinner, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. And what terrified her the most was that she didn't know how she felt about it. Sophia Carter had never been more uncomfortable in her entire life. The restaurant was warm, filled with the quiet hum of conversation and the clinking of fine china, yet all she could hear was the pounding of her own heart. Richard Calloway's assumption, his insinuation, that there was something between her and Sebastian had left her feeling rattled. She sneaked a glance at her boss, who was sitting beside her, his face unreadable as he continued the conversation like nothing had happened, as if the words hadn't affected him at all. But that was just like him, wasn't it? Sebastian Walker was impossible to read, impossible to fluster. Meanwhile, she was sitting there, struggling to steady her breath, her fingers curled tightly around the fabric of her dress. Why was she so affected? She was just his secretary, nothing more. And yet, for the rest of the dinner, her thoughts refused to settle. It wasn't until nearly an hour later that the dinner finally ended. Sebastian and Calloway shook hands, both men looking pleased with the outcome of their business discussion. "I have to say, Walker, I like the way you negotiate," Calloway said with an approving nod. "You drive a hard bargain, but you know how to keep things professional. A rare quality these days." Sebastian smirked slightly. "That's what makes a good businessman." Calloway chuckled, then turned to Sophia. "And you, Miss Carter, you did well tonight. I like a woman who pays attention to detail." "Thank you, Mr. Calloway," she said politely, keeping her tone neutral. Calloway gave them one last knowing look before excusing himself, leaving Sophia alone with Sebastian in the elegant restaurant. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "That went well," she muttered, more to herself than to him. "Indeed," Sebastian agreed. She turned to him, trying to act normal. "Are we heading back to the office or?" Sebastian cut her off. "No. You're done for the night." Sophia blinked. "Oh, okay." She should have felt relieved, but instead she felt strangely unsettled. Like there was something unsaid lingering between them. "Come on," he said, standing up. "I'll drive you home." Sophia hesitated. "Oh, that's not necessary. I can just call a cab or—" "Sophia," he said, his voice holding just the slightest edge of impatience. She froze. He rarely ever used her first name. For some reason, hearing it come from his lips made her stomach twist. "Let's go," he said simply. She didn't argue. The car ride was quiet. Sebastian drove with effortless confidence, his hands steady on the wheel, his expression calm. Meanwhile, Sophia sat beside him, her fingers tangled in her lap, her mind racing. The tension was unbearable. "About earlier," she blurted out, breaking the silence. Sebastian didn't take his eyes off the road. "What about it?" She hesitated. "What Calloway said. About us." Sebastian didn't immediately respond. Then, after a long pause, he said, "What about it?" Ophia frowned. "It was weird, don't you think?" Finally, he glanced at her. Just for a brief second. "Was it?" She let out a frustrated sigh. "Come on, Sebastian. You know how it sounded." A ghost of a smirk touched his lips. "It sounded like he thought we were involved." Sophia felt her face heat up. "Exactly. And you just let him assume that." Sebastian shrugged. "Does it matter?" Her jaw nearly dropped. "Of course it matters." He didn't respond immediately, but she could see the amusement in his eyes. "Why?" he finally asked. Ophia blinked. "What do you mean, why?" "Because it's not true." Sebastian hummed thoughtfully. "And yet, you're the only one panicking about it." She clenched her fists. "Because it's ridiculous." "If it's so ridiculous," he said smoothly, "then why are you still thinking about it?" Sophia opened her mouth, then closed it again. Why was she still thinking about it? The answer should have been simple. It was just an offhand comment. Nothing more. And yet, it did bother her. Not because she had feelings for Sebastian, she didn't, but because he hadn't even reacted. He hadn't denied it. Hadn't corrected Calloway. Hadn't looked the least bit surprised. It was almost as if he didn't mind the idea. Sophia suddenly felt very, very trapped. "You're overthinking," Sebastian said, pulling her out of her thoughts. She turned to glare at him. "I am not overthinking." He smirked. "You are." She groaned, leaning back in her seat. "You're insufferable." He chuckled softly. "I've been called worse." For the rest of the drive, neither of them spoke. But even as Sophia stared out the window, pretending to be lost in thought, she was painfully aware of the man sitting beside her. And she couldn't stop wondering. Had she been wrong all along? Was it possible that he felt something too? Sophia barely slept that night. She had spent hours tossing and turning, her mind replaying every detail of the dinner, every word of the conversation in the car, and, most frustrating of all, Sebastian's unreadable expression when Calloway had assumed they were together. Didn't make sense. Sebastian Walker was her boss. A man who, by all logic, should have dismissed the comment immediately. But instead, he had let it linger, almost as if he had considered the idea. And that was what had kept her awake. The possibility. The next morning, she walked into the office determined to push the thoughts aside. This was just a job. Sebastian Walker was just her employer. She would not let a misunderstanding ruin her focus. But her resolve was tested the moment she stepped into his office. He was already seated at his desk, his piercing blue eyes lifting to meet hers as soon as she entered. "Good morning, Miss Carter," he said smoothly. Sophia hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding. "Good morning, sir." She was proud of how steady her voice sounded. Sebastian leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Sleep well." Her pulse quickened. Was he teasing her again? "I slept fine," she lied. He arched a brow, clearly not believing her. "Good. We have a full schedule today." Sophia nodded, stepping closer to place some documents on his desk. "Your first meeting is at 9. After that, you have a conference call with the Tokyo office. I've also arranged for." "You're avoiding me." The words were so direct, so unexpected, that Sophia froze mid-sentence. She slowly looked up at him. I'm not avoiding you." Sebastian tilted his head slightly, as if challenging her to continue lying. She cleared her throat, forcing herself to stand straighter. "I'm just focused on work, as I should be." Sebastian tapped his fingers against the desk. "Interesting." She frowned. "What is?" "The way you suddenly feel the need to clarify that," he mused. Her stomach twisted. "Mr. Walker, if this is about last night." "It is," he interrupted. Sophia inhaled sharply, trying to maintain her composure. There's nothing to talk about. Is that so? Yes, she said firmly. It was just an awkward moment. It doesn't mean anything. Sebastian didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood up from his chair, walking around the desk until he was standing directly in front of her. Sophia stiffened. She was used to seeing him from a professional distance, across the desk during meetings or walking through the office hallways. But standing this close, she became painfully aware of just how tall he was, how sharp his features were, how his cologne subtly filled the air around him. You really believe that? He asked, his voice lower now. Sophia swallowed hard. Yes. Sebastian studied her for a long moment, as if searching for something in her expression. Then slowly he smirked. If you say so, Miss Carter. She let out a quiet breath, relieved that he was dropping the subject. But as she turned to leave, his next words made her stop in her tracks. Join me for lunch today. She blinked, turning back to him. Lunch? Yes, he said casually, as if it were a completely normal request. There's something I want to discuss. Sophia hesitated. Was this another business meeting? Or was it something else? Is this work-related? She asked cautiously. Sebastian's smirk deepened slightly. You'll find out. Her heart pounded. You should say no. You should. But instead she found herself nodding. All right. At exactly noon, Sophia found herself sitting across from Sebastian in one of the most luxurious restaurants in the city. The kind of place where the waiters wore tuxedos, the menus had no prices, and the air was thick with wealth and exclusivity. Sebastian, of course, looked completely at home. Sophia, on the other hand, felt out of place. She placed her hands in her lap, trying not to fidget as she watched him scan the menu. You can relax, you know, he said without looking up. Sophia straightened. I am relaxed. Sebastian raised an eyebrow. You look like you're preparing for a job interview. She exhaled. That's because I have no idea why I'm here. He closed the menu and leaned back. Do you always need a reason? When it comes to you? She gave him a pointed look. Yes. Sebastian chuckled, clearly amused. A waiter arrived to take their orders, and once they were alone again, Sebastian finally spoke. Do you remember what Calloway said last night? Sophia's grip on her napkin tightened. So this is why we're here. She forced herself to remain composed. Yes. Sebastian tapped his fingers on the table, watching her closely. And you seemed very affected by it. Sophia's eyes narrowed slightly. Because it was inappropriate. Was it? Yes, she insisted. Sebastian tilted his head. You're sure? Sophia felt her patience slipping. Mr. Walker, why are we talking about this? Because I think you're lying to yourself, he said calmly. She blinked. What? Sebastian leaned forward slightly. You keep saying it meant nothing, that there's nothing between us. But I think part of you is starting to question that. Her breath hitched. That was the problem with Sebastian Walker. He was too damn perceptive. She had spent all night convincing herself that she was overthinking. That Calloway's comment had only bothered her because it had been unexpected. But now, sitting here under his intense gaze, she realized something terrifying. He was right. Somewhere deep down, a small part of her had started to wonder. And that was dangerous, because lines like these were not meant to be crossed. Sophia forced a small, professional smile. I think you're reading too much into it, Mr. Walker. Sebastian's lips curled at the corners. Am I? Yes, she said firmly. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. Very well. The conversation ended there. But the tension between them remained. And as they ate in silence, Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something neither of them were prepared for. Sophia Carter knew she was in trouble. Real, undeniable trouble. Ever since the lunch with Sebastian, she had been walking on thin ice. Except the ice was her own emotions, and the more she tried to deny them, the more they cracked beneath her feet. She had told herself repeatedly that Sebastian Walker was just her boss, that the strange tension between them was nothing but a misunderstanding, that her heart shouldn't race whenever he looked at her for a second too long. But the more she denied it, the more obvious the truth became. She was falling for him. And worse, she suspected he knew it. The office felt different now. Sebastian wasn't doing anything outwardly inappropriate, but there were moments, small, fleeting moments, where she could feel his eyes lingering on her. A brush of his hand when he handed her a file. A barely noticeable smirk whenever he caught her staring at him, which to her horror was happening far too often. Little things. Things that shouldn't have meant anything. And yet they did. Sophia had always prided herself on being professional. She had worked too hard to build her career to let something like a crush ruin it. So why did she feel like she was losing control? It was nearly 9 at night when she found herself alone in the office with Sebastian. Most of the staff had left hours ago, but Sebastian had asked her to stay late to go over some last-minute reports before an important meeting the next morning. She told herself that this was normal, that it was just work, that the fact that it was just the two of them didn't mean anything. Yet, as she sat across from him in the dimly lit office, reviewing documents while the city lights glowed outside the window, she felt the weight of something unspoken settling between them. Sebastian leaned back in his chair, stretching slightly. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar. His sleeves rolled up, exposing his forearms. He looked less like the intimidating CEO and more like a man who had been working too hard. "How much more do we have left?" he asked, rubbing his temples. Sophia glanced at her notes. "Just one more section." Sebastian sighed. "Good. I'm starving." She smiled slightly. "You could have ordered something." He raised an eyebrow. "And let you starve too. That would be bad leadership." Sophia chuckled. "I think I'll survive." Sebastian studied her for a moment, then stood up. "Come on." She blinked. "What?" He grabbed his suit jacket, tossing it over his arm. "Let's go get something to eat." Sophia hesitated. "It's late." "Exactly," he said. "Which means no fancy business dinners. Just food. And before you argue, this is not a request." Her stomach betrayed her with a quiet growl. Sebastian smirked. "That settles it." Against her better judgment, she followed him out of the office. Sophia had expected him to take her to some high-end restaurant, but to her surprise, they ended up at a small 24-hour diner tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. The kind of place with neon lights, vinyl booths, and a menu that hadn't changed in decades. Sebastian slid into a booth, looking more relaxed than she had ever seen him. "Didn't peg you as a diner kind of guy," she admitted, sitting across from him. He smirked. "There's a lot you don't know about me, Miss Carter." She bit her lip. Apparently, a waitress came by, taking their orders. Sophia got a simple grilled cheese sandwich, while Sebastian ordered a burger. As they waited, the conversation turned casual, something that rarely happened between them. They talked about little things, movies, places they had traveled to. For the first time since she had started working for him, Sophia felt like she was talking to Sebastian, not the ruthless CEO but the man beneath the suit. And she liked him. Too much. "You're staring," Sebastian said suddenly, breaking the moment. Sophia's eyes widened. "What?" "No, I wasn't." He chuckled. "Relax, Carter. I don't mind." Her face burned. "I wasn't staring," she muttered. He smirked but said nothing, taking a sip of his coffee. The night continued like that, easy, effortless. And for a little while, Sophia forgot about all the reasons why she shouldn't be enjoying this. It wasn't until they were standing outside the diner, waiting for their car, that the air between them shifted again. Sebastian glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Did you have fun?" he asked. Sophia smiled. "Yeah, I did." He nodded, his gaze lingering on her. Then after a pause he said, "Sophia." Her breath hitched. He never used her first name unless he was being serious. Before she could ask why, he stepped closer, just a little. Close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body. Close enough that her heart started racing. "There's something I've been wanting to tell you," he murmured. Sophia's pulse pounded in her ears. "You should stop this. You should." But she couldn't move. Sebastian studied her for a long moment, as if searching for something in her expression. Then, in a voice so low it was barely above a whisper, he said, "I knew who you were the first day you walked into my office." Sophia froze. Her mind struggled to process his words. "What?" Sebastian's eyes locked onto hers, something unreadable flickering in them. "You think I fell for you after the bathroom incident?" His lips curved slightly. "But the truth is, I already knew you before that." Her world tilted. "Knew me?" she echoed, barely able to get the words out. Sebastian took another step closer. 3 years ago," he said, "there was a woman I met. Just once. In a cafe on a rainy afternoon." Sophia's breath caught in her throat. "I spilled coffee on her," he continued, his voice softer now. "She laughed instead of getting angry. Said something about how accidents make the best stories." Her heart stopped. She remembered. It had been a random afternoon. A stranger had bumped into her, spilling coffee all over her blouse. She had laughed it off, making a joke about fate. She had never seen him again. Or so she had thought. "You," she whispered. "That was you." Sebastian nodded. "I never forgot you, Sophia." Her knees felt weak. All this time, had fate really brought them back together? Or had Sebastian Walker been searching for her all along? And if he had, what did that mean for them now?